Nina Ansary is a historian, a human rights advocate, an expert on the women's movement in Iran. Her book, Jewels of Allah, The Untold Story of Women in Iran, was published earlier this year, and it is a courageous and provocative intervention that challenges the stereotypes of contemporary women in Iran. In addition to this inspiring text, many of you know her from her expansive social media presence and her use of this platform to connect women from around the world through her work as an activist for gender equality. In addition to these venues, she is also a well-known contributor to the Daily Beast, Women's E-News, BBC, Al Jazeera, and the Huffington Post. In all of these sites, Nina Ansary is a tireless and tenacious feminist advocate for women's rights to dignity and integrity transnationally. Yet I have to say that what unifies all of her writing to me is the fact that she is also a deeply committed and passionate feminist, and above all, a generous thinker and advocate. I met Nina for the first time last year, literally about this time last year, and I am thrilled to be able to bring her back to campus and to share her work and her insights with the Barnard and Columbia communities. We are equally delighted to have our distinguished colleague from across the street, Professor Bulliet, joining Nina in conversation on her work on women in Iran. Professor Bulliet is an emeritus professor of Middle East history at Columbia, where he also directed the Middle East Institute at the School of International and Public Affairs for 12 years. He is one of the leading scholars of Iran, the social history of the Islamic Middle East, and the 20th century resurgence of Islam. He is the author of 9 books and 6 novels focusing on a range of topics that include Iran and the larger Muslim world, as well as the history of technology and animal domestication. Our speakers will be engaging each other in about 20 minutes of dialogue, and we will then be joined by Professor Deborah Spar, who will take over as moderator in an open discussion with members of the audience. Following the discussion, Nina has graciously agreed to sign copies of the book, which will be available for purchase outside in the vestibule there. I'd like to emphasize as well that all the proceeds from the book are being donated to charitable organizations, in particular to the Omid Foundation, which works to support and empower disadvantaged women in Iran. Finally, I want to invite you all very, very graciously to join us for a short reception following the event, which will happen here in this same room. Please join me in welcoming Nina Ansary, Richard Bulliet, and Deborah Spar. Thank you.
Well, good evening. Thank you very much for that introduction. I don't feel like I should be a co-equal with our honored guests and alumna for this event. Because I'm not a specialist on women in Iran. Nevertheless, I have a few things to say. Partly because this is not only about women in Iran, but this is about how Americans think of women in Iran. And that perhaps makes a few remarks that I have to make a little more relevant. On Facebook yesterday, I saw something, and somebody had said, if Ansary got her PhD at Columbia, she probably worked with Bulliet. And then somebody had responded, no, Bulliet knows about a lot of things, but he doesn't know anything about post-revolutionary Iran. And I only mention that to emphasize that Nina's doctoral work was not something that was handed to her as a topic by her sponsor. She found so many things and went through so much material that I knew nothing about that it was kind of, from my point of view, the ideal thing where I learned much more from the doctoral student than they learned from me. Nevertheless, as I say, I have a couple of things to say about women in Iran. I first went to Iran 50 years ago with my late wife, and we spent some time in the city of Nishapur, where my first book, my doctoral dissertation, was focused on. And in Nishapur at that time, 1966, there were 3 women who did not wear a chador. In the entire city, about 30,000 people. I'm pretty sure there was only 3. There was the wife of the French cotton expert, who was there to advise the farmers. There was my wife, and there was the wife of the chief of the education system in Nishapur, who was an Iranian who had migrated from the Soviet Union. And she had grown up in the Soviet system where they thought it was, of course, foolish to be wearing a chador. Otherwise, all of the women wore a chador, which was a normally black garment that went from here all the way down to the ground. And if you were, if you wanted to, you could sort of hold it over your face or put it in your teeth and hold it that over your face that way if it's something to carry. But the chador was the norm for Iran outside the capital at that time. When my wife went to the public bath during the time when it was open for women, children threw pebbles at her on the street because she wasn't wearing a chador. I was back in Iran a number of years later, in 1977, the last time I was there before the revolution. And of course, enormous changes had taken place, particularly after 1973, when you'd had an oil price shock that really changed many things in the world. And the chador was one of those things that was advertised as now being on the way out. I was in Hamadan, which was another provincial city, somewhat larger than Nishapur, at a conference. And the conference was under the sponsorship of the Empress. So at the initial meeting of the conference, every public employee in Hamadan attended. And I was the first speaker, and so there's this movie theater filled with hundreds of people who had no idea what I was talking about. And then as soon as we had the coffee break, all of the audience disappeared, and we were down to the 20 or so conferees. They'd shown up because they had been ordered to. And that evening, there was a reception at the Officers Club. The Officers Club was an important thing because the army was very important under the Shah. And in the room, a room probably close to the size of this, you had all of the officers from the Iranian army stationed in Hamadan and all of their wives. And all of their wives were wearing party dresses. There's not a single chador to be seen. And they were all sitting in chairs lining the perimeter of the room. And then you had a sort of cordon sanitaire of about 4 or 5 feet before you got the cluster of men in the center of the room talking to each other. No woman talked to any man, and no man talked to any woman. But they were not wearing the chador. And all the women looked incredibly uncomfortable. We had one woman in the conference, the redoubtable Anne Lambton of the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. She talked to women, but nobody else did. And yet, Americans were very much of the opinion that things were changing in Iran because the chador was on the way out. But you don't change attitudes just by changing clothes. The last time I was in Iran was 20 years after that, in 1996. And I went to I was in Tehran. I went to the Tehran Book Fair, which was, about 3 circus tent-sized pavilions with hundreds of exhibitors showing books. Before the revolution, you did not want to go to an Iranian bookstore. There was nothing interesting to buy. But here were all these exhibitors, and it was thronged with high school and college students, boys and girls, running back and forth, looking at the books, seemingly interacting with one another, no security around. All of the girls had chadors on, or hijab. Some of them had chadors, the old style. Most of them just had the hijab, the scarf. And I thought, well, those officers' wives dressed in ways that would suit Americans before the revolution. But now, after the revolution, the clothing seemed to be more conservative. But the women weren't. And that leads me to Nina's doctoral thesis, because what I think she has focused on most effectively in the thesis is the degree to which the last 35 years of the Islamic Republic of Iran has seen an enormous change in the activities and the education and the behavior of women, changes that were not advocated by the leadership of the country, but came about anyway. And I think that what I want to start with is asking Nina, how did this come about? How did women, under a repressive and only partially democratic religious regime, become so very active in comparison to the way things had been prior to the revolution? So, Nina.
Thank you so much. Tina, thank you so much for the kind introduction. I'm thrilled to be back at Barnard, and thank you for the lovely foundation for our conversation. The most phenomenal thing about Iran is that I was a woman born in Iran and I left at the cusp of the revolution, and much of what I uncovered about women in Iran did not come from my own background or from mainstream media for that matter. It came about through the mentorship of Professor Bulliet and Professor Kamali, who's here in the audience tonight. Really, for me, was eye-opening because, as Professor Bulliet said, what the Pahlavi monarchy had envisioned prior to the Islamic Republic, which is a Western trend, and the adoption of Western customs has actually come to fruition during a most unexpected era, which is an oppressive era, which is an era that has embedded gender discriminatory laws at every turn. But here you have not only women, but a whole new generation of Iranians who don't subscribe to this ideology. In terms of women in Iran, one of the most empowering mediums has been the value of their education. You had a predominantly dormant traditional segment during the Pahlavi monarchy, which did not understand the rapid motion towards the adoption of Western customs. So you had a traditional segment that, despite all the rights bestowed, did not take advantage, nor did they embrace those rights in the proper manner. So you have what's really on the surface when you look at it, liberating mediums initiated by the Pahlavi monarchy were only embraced by a very small, minor percentage of women who took advantage of them. And what we look at on the surface as seemingly liberal and liberated for many women ended up being restrictive. Namely, what Professor Bulliet touched on, which is you saw women who did not embrace the adoption of a Western attire or Western lifestyle. These women actually, when Khomeini initially came to power and mandated the veil was a welcome alternative for so many women initially who actually felt more comfortable coming out of seclusion. The other phenomenal discovery that we made during my journey was that the Western educational infrastructure that the Pahlavi monarchy had embedded with the help of the US was actually never dismantled, despite the fact that the Islamic Republic, for the first 3 years, decided to embark on Islamization of the nation. So what we discovered in looking at specifically the elementary school textbooks was that not only was the Western educational infrastructure not dismantled, and the right thing to have done was to revert back to the traditional religious schools that were the norm prior to the Pahlavi monarchy. Not only were they not reverted back to that, the elementary school textbooks that were used during the Pahlavi monarchy were also pretty much kept intact and merely superficially Islamicized. So that's one of the reasons, a small pocket of why you have an empowered generation of women is that they were raised and reared in this Western educational infrastructure. Part of my work centered on why this new generation that has really been cut off from the West, because this regime, the hardliners, are adverse to the West, subscribes to a Western mentality despite an oppressive atmosphere, is
being educated in a Western medium. Two was the fact that the reversion back to single-sex schools, which is a lot of outsiders tend to look at that as an oppressive, segregated society, was also a welcome alternative for traditional families who felt comfortable sending their daughters to become educated in single-sex environments. Now, in the 90s, which is after Khomeini came to power, there was actually a series of studies that came out in Western nations, in Europe and specifically in America, that actually proved how empowering, specifically for women, single-sex education at the primary and secondary level is. So I refer to this as really the perfect storm where women in Iran are concerned, because some of the seemingly backward measures ended up empowering the women of Iran.
So say a little bit about the ways in, let me make it clear here, just the substantial majority of all of the university students in Iran are women. The level of literacy in Iran for women is way over 90%, and it is maybe next to Israel, perhaps Turkey, has the best educated women and most literate women and the broadest education of women in the Middle East. And it is it appeared to be a paradox. And how could you have a religious regime dominated by clerics, overwhelmingly dominated by clerics, who were not friendly to women in particular, who had very traditional views? How could women have done so well in education? They certainly were not doing well to the same degree in jobs or things like that. But you mentioned the wearing of the hijab. And what, for people who lived in villages, Iran at the time of the revolution was still a country of villages. How did they feel about sending their daughters to school if they could not wear the chador?
Well, you mean pre-revolution,
Yeah.
right? Well, a lot of them actually forbid their daughters from going to school, meaning you had very few women who came from traditional families, young girls whose families felt comfortable sending them to school in a co-educational, westernized environment. So actually, a lot of these families did not allow their daughters to go to school in these environments. You had very few families, traditional families, who were not averse, despite the fact that it conflicted with their own ideological mores. But predominantly, these young girls were kept at home. And specifically with rural families, they actually used their children as part of the workforce in the agricultural sector. So it wasn't, one was that they used the children as part of their workforce, and two, they didn't relate to this climate, were uncomfortable sending their 8-year-old to sit next to a girl without a headscarf and a miniskirt. So it kind of worked in sync, and they sort of, it was sort of something that they could not embrace. It was an overnight change. And, the literacy courses that were sent to the rural areas talk about when we were looking.
That was in the time of the Shah.
Right, at the primary sources, how they were sent to, because they were aware that this was having adverse effects, they even implemented Quranic recitations as part of the curriculum. They even tried to separate the classroom with boys on one side, girls on one side, but it really was to no avail, really. We remember when we looked at the material and the interviews that they had done with the literacy corps, men and women had all said that we tried our best to get these families to send their daughters to school, and they just were not buying it.
Now, if you go to school, of course, that's a good thing. But there's a question of what are you being taught in school, and what are you learning? 2 weeks ago, I was in Qatar, in the Persian Gulf, where as University of Qatar. University of Qatar is 77% female. And it's two campuses, well, the campus is split between the boys' half and the girls' half, so they do not mix. It, like the University of the United Arab Republic, that the United Arab Emirates, that I was visiting a couple of years before that, which was 80% female, it's about as bad an education as there is anywhere in terms of quality of instruction and in terms of the the quality of the graduates as they come out. In Iran, it appears that the women who get an education actually are educated and are able to read things. Now, one of the things that happened in the Arab Gulf is that they decided they should have education in English because English is the international language, the language of the future, and so forth and so on. So here you had girls who, many of them really did not understand English, who were going to college, getting degrees in English language university. I took over one class and I asked them, how long it would take them to read a 30-page article in English. And they said, well, that would take the entire semester. Of course, that's the way we used to learn Arabic here, where you'd read 30 pages a year. And then the professor would give a lecture in English and then stand in the hallway afterwards and repeat it in Arabic, so the girls could understand something. Now, the girls were happy because they were away from home. And otherwise, they would sit home with their mothers and their aunts and learn to be traditional Arab women of the Gulf variety. But this question of quality has a lot to do with what language you're teaching in. And one thing that happened in Iran is that the language of instruction is Persian. And you have one thing after the revolution, there was an absolute flood of Western books translated into Persian. So could you say something about the intellectual quality of the women whom you deal with?
Well, first of all, one thing that we're also not aware of out here is that, and I wanted to highlight this specifically tonight and then get back to your question, is that Iran, everyone tends to look at this regime as one entity. Iran actually has, under this banner, has progressive clerics. And so what was very important also that empowered these women was the presidency of Mohammad Khatami, who was really a moderate and allowed for the infiltration of numerous feminist publications, were procured licenses and allowed to operate within this oppressive environment. Now, the feminist publications that I specifically looked at that came about during the Khatami era were actually in so many ways more progressive and more inclusive where a woman's rights is concerned from a global perspective than the ones that were used pre-revolution. So that also, Professor Bulliet, I know I analyzed those magazines as well. I mean, these young girls are also being exposed to a plethora of feminist publications for 8 years as well. So that was also taken into consideration. And these were also magazines that translated excerpts from renowned Western feminists like Simone de Beauvoir, Virginia Woolf. This is the language that these girls were exposed to that was translated in a language that they could relate to, that they could understand, and also a language that conveyed that the West, which this regime shuns, particularly when the supreme leader comes out and says that gender equality is one of the West's biggest misconceptions. These magazines actually showcase the more common ingredients between Western women and Iranian women, namely the fact that Western women were also once inflicted with patriarchal boundaries and that we have more in common that is assumed.
I want to point out one thing here about your book. I thought when I saw it, well, this is her doctoral dissertation rewritten in a more accessible fashion, which it is. But then in the back of the book, you have a kind of pictures and capsule stories of eminent Iranian women. Scarcely any of them would be people Americans would have heard of. But can you tell us something about some of these women that you celebrate in the book?
Oh, these women are actually I rewrote my doctoral thesis because Professor Bulliet encouraged me to rewrite my doctoral thesis as a mainstream book. So I have to give him the credit for that. So I actually asked Professor Bulliet, I don't think anybody really cares about women in Iran. And he said, well, you don't know that, and I don't know that. I care, and you care, and that's good enough. So you should really go about rewriting this in a way that maybe your daughter can read and enjoy, as opposed to a dense doctoral thesis. So while I was rewriting the manuscript, I decided to post every Monday, Wednesday, Friday on social media a photograph of an accomplished Iranian woman. Now, this could be a woman during the Achaemenid era, which is pre-Islam, a woman in post-revolutionary Iran with a small caption of her accomplishment in order to gauge public interest. So these women that Professor Bulliet refers to are the compilation of women from March 2014 to March 2015, and it's still ongoing, that I highlighted on my social media page, and that so many followers would say, can you please put this in your book? Because while I was rewriting the book, a lot of the narrative that I infused in the book came from, a lot of them actually came from social media engagement of followers. So I decided, because I got so many requests to put this in the book, I couldn't infuse these women into the body of the book, but I decided to devote a whole chapter at the very end and called it Exemplary Women of Iran, women who've contributed throughout the centuries to empowering and laying the foundation for women's empowerment. So it's really a way for the book to end that's an homage to the Iranian women throughout the centuries.
And one of these days we're going to have to put an entry on you, but I think maybe we should open it up now.
First of all, just on behalf of the college, let me re-welcome everybody here. And in answer to the rhetorical question you just raised, do people care about women in Iran? I think the size of the audience here is an incredible testament, not only to the importance of this issue, but of course to the importance of the work you've done. I want to throw out one pitch for a moment, and then I will take advantage of my position to ask one question, and then I'll open it up to the floor. But what Nina was just talking about, and the spread of, in this case, feminist ideas from women like Simone de Beauvoir to women in Iran and women around the world, is very much a part of the project that Tina and her colleagues at the BCRW here at Barnard are working on, under the label of the project called Transnational Feminisms. She and her colleagues, and presumably some of you in the room, are really trying to understand these networks and how information seeps across borders, even to places that we might consider sort of unlikely hotbeds of feminist ideas.
Deborah, I'm really glad you brought this up. I wanted to bring this up again. This is what I specifically talk about is not an Iran problem. It's a global problem. It's a global epidemic. Just to give you some statistics that just came out at the World Economic Forum, 100 countries around the world have at least one or more gender discriminatory laws within their system. Over 59 countries worldwide do not have any laws against sexual harassment of women at work. Over 32 countries in the world, women can't apply for a passport the same way men can. Over 18 countries worldwide, a woman needs her husband can ban a woman from taking any job that he feels interferes with family life, and this narrative goes on and on. What's most important is that we live in America, and sometimes I think we take our rights for granted. Worldwide, a quarter of girls worldwide will get married, are getting married before the age of 18. Between 2011 and 2020, an estimated 140 million girls will be married before the age of 18. Out of this number, roughly 50% of them will be below the age of 15. So not only are we not there, we're far, far from it. Now, I see a lot of men in the audience here tonight, which is great, because what I wanted to highlight is that part of women achieving gender equality rests on men supporting women. That a lot of the narrative gets lost because gender equality is always framed as predominantly as a woman's issue, and that's not the case. When we frame that as a woman's issue, we continue to perpetuate the male-female divide and continue to perpetuate gender inequality. I wanted to also applaud a gentleman that just became the Prime Minister of Canada. Justin Trudeau made a campaign pledge to put equal number of women and men in his cabinet. The first thing he did is 50% of his cabinet is all women. So I wanted to applaud him for doing so. That's a huge, monumental step, and the first thing he actually implemented when he went to office.
That's great. So I'm going to ask one question, and then be preparing your questions, put your hand up, and we will have people run around and get you microphones. But the question I want to ask has to do with technology. Professor Bulliet, I know you are an historian and part of technology. And Nina, I think many of us have remarked that not only have you written a wonderful but fairly traditional book with covers and typeface and photos and all this, but you have an extraordinary social media presence. And I'm sure at least some of the people in this room today came to know you and your work via your presence on social media. So what role do you think technology is playing now with regard to spreading ideas, with giving women in Iran and other places a voice that they might not have otherwise had? And on the flip side, is technology also perhaps being a force for repression in the Middle East and elsewhere?
Deborah, this is a great question. As far as my work is concerned, Tina and I were speaking earlier that I don't know how I would have been able to get my work off the ground if there wasn't social media. As a woman who's almost 50 years old, social media, Facebook, all these things are my daughter's generation. I never had a Facebook page till 2 years ago. And by Facebook page, I mean I have an author page where I post these women. But specifically Twitter and the board, and I know you and I follow each other on Twitter, the borderless, which is great because I get to see what Deborah's up to and vice versa. The borderless nature of social media, specifically Twitter, because it has a 140 character limitation, is priceless. Meaning I have about roughly 4,000 followers from Iran. This would have never happened if it weren't for social media. This has been a phenomenal way for me to communicate with people in Iran. Some of the posts I put up, like the only woman firefighter in the city of Ahvaz came to me from a young woman in Iran who sent the clipping from me from the city of Ahvaz, Shema Rashidi, 24, the only female firefighter. I actually told her, I won't post this because I don't want to get her in trouble. And she said, no, I don't care, please post her. Not only did I post her, she's in the epilogue of the book, she's in the trailer of my book. So for me, it's been amazing. The best part of my day is having conversations with these women in Iran. The best part of my day is connecting to other women in a global context. I think if social media is used properly and in the right context, it has a powerful connecting force, in my opinion. You know, it amplifies the voices of so many women, so many oppressed women, so many women who want to be given a voice. Nobel laureate Shirin Ebadi, who left Iran in 2009, the first female Nobel laureate in Iran, recently said that she's been to jail for her activism. She said, I don't have a problem going back to Iran. A lot of my friends have been to jail, are in jail, I'm in jail. The reason I have elected to stay on the outside is to give these women a voice. Now, to have a voice and be able to use it on social media is huge, specifically for women in oppressed nations who want to be given a voice and want to be heard.
Great. The floor is open. Let's give a microphone to the woman in the blue right on the aisle there. You can stand up and start talking, and they'll run you a mic. And if you wouldn't mind just briefly giving us your name.
My name is Barbara Marwell, and I'm an alum from 57. I'm interested in the paradox between the repressive regime and the fact that they permitted the translation and dissemination of Western literature. I'd be interested in your reflections on that, both of you, actually.
Well, there are many ways you can approach that. After the revolution, they closed the universities. University professors knew foreign languages, and now they weren't getting a salary. So you had to phenomenal number of books translated from English, French, and German into Persian by these guys who wanted to make a living when they weren't teaching. And so Western literature began to come in that way, and you did have a censorship. The censorship, I had one of my books was translated into Persian, and I was told, well, the censorship is Shiite clerics, and they will go through the book to see if there's anything nasty about Shiism. And that's it. And so they found one sentence in my book that they took some issue with, and so they put a little note before the title page saying, you know, a believer might not be, you know, have to follow this in the book. But, you know, almost no books say anything about Shiism at all. So an incredible number of things got translated, but not really feminist things in that initial period. So the question is, how did the feminists
You know, another important point is Azar Nafisi has written a best-selling novel called Reading Lolita in Tehran. Now, Azar Nafisi is a prominent professor and historian and author who has since 2009 left Iran, but she talks about how even though the regime banned her and shut down the universities for 3 years, Islamicizing all the textbooks, that she continued underground to teach everything that was banned and forbidden, namely feminist publications, to her students. And she did this for years and years and years. Now, she brought this story out. Can you imagine the numerous professors who didn't bring their stories up but continued to do so despite the forbidden nature of it? Meaning, you know, you have oppression and you ban certain publications on the surface, but underground, even today, underground, everything that's forbidden is being carried out. So you really have a society that had the infiltration of forbidden products being continuously disseminated in an underground manner, and that continues even on today.
A woman in the white on the edge there.
Morella Servadidio, Professor Emerita, and class of 55. Professor Bulliet has mentioned that women comprise almost 80% of the university seats, or a very high percentage of students are women. My question is, upon graduation, do they step into a kind of professional and economic void? Or does the education avail them to a degree? What percentage becomes assimilated into a workforce?
Well, let me just say that I was talking about the Arab Gulf, particularly United Arab Emirates and Qatar, the two universities that I've visited I know about. And the women there do not go into jobs. I mean, they don't have decent educations. In Iran, the percentage of women in the universities is more like 56%?
It's 60%, almost 60% women dominate in the university sector. But this is a great question because women, despite the fact that they outnumber men in higher education, because of the pervading patriarchy and the gender discriminatory laws, are not adequately absorbed into the economic sector. Currently, you have approximately 75% of university graduates who do not have what's really viewed as an appropriate job for a university graduate. Approximately 40% of university graduates remain without proper employment. As such, women are carrying out businesses from inside their homes, such as seamstresses, caterers, as such. A lot of the women that I have spoken to decide not to actually opt out of going into the job market because of the patriarchal ideology that dominates. They feel uncomfortable. They feel that they are not in positions where they can be effective.
Let's go all the way down here in the second row.
Hi, thank you. My name is Rebecca, and I graduated in 1992. And my family is actually from Iran, and I'm here with two members of my book group whose families are also from Iran. I've never been there, though. I wish I had. I have some questions regarding, first, the cost of education in Iran. I found myself thinking about, the issues we have in the United States about affordability of education, whether it's subsidized, state-sponsored, do you have to be affluent to go to school? That if you could speak to that, and also whether this wave of education also applies to minorities such as Jews and Baha'is and Zoroastrians, or is it mostly just Muslim women who predominate? And also whether you see a political future to this educational trend.
Education in Iran is subsidized. That's as far as my understanding is, it's subsidized. So you don't have to be wealthy to get an education. In terms of minorities, the Baha'is are persecuted in Iran. They're banned from a lot of the educational entities, banned from a lot of different organizations. It's just the Iranian government, the Islamic regime, does not consider Baha'is a viable religion, and so the persecution against Baha'is is atrocious. Jews are people of the book. Anything that's a religion, any religion that has Christians, Jews, they are allowed to practice. They are not overtly discriminated against. But I would have to say that the majority of those getting an education are predominantly Muslim. And go ahead. No, go. And you asked about the future of Iran. I think, if there is going to be any kind of a push towards a more progressive atmosphere, it's going to definitely come from women. Women have shown over and over again their resilience. You have countless women's rights activists, highly educated women's rights activists who continue to pay a high price for their activism, go to jail, come out and continue their activism. They have actually made, not by your definition or mine, tremendous strides, but nevertheless, they have made strides. They have partially reversed some of the gender discriminatory laws. This is a grassroots movement. It's fueled by women from all walks of life. They are continuously breaking barriers. It's slow, but the fact is it's an ongoing activism, and it's not one that, it's definitely one that women have shown that they don't bend to the regime and their irrational laws.
I can't help asking. Yeah. So will the recent agreement with the United States, do you think, will it push in a continually progressive direction or not?
I think that's a great question. I get asked that a lot, and I think that's a great question. For women, this nuclear deal is from a strictly humanitarian perspective. The regime does not want this deal to happen. This deal was brokered by moderates on both sides. And simply speaking, with regards to women in Iran, they feel, although this deal does not address human rights, women's rights, they're hoping that by bringing Iran somewhat out of isolation, by opening up more economic opportunities for the population, that it has what they refer to as a multiplier effect, meaning that you open one small door, it'll enable another door to open. The whole premise is to bring Iran out of isolation. And once this regime actually has been carrying out a lot of its human rights violations behind closed doors. So once you start opening up doors, just recently by opening up doors, and again, the social media has been powerful to opening up doors, because although Facebook and Twitter and Instagram are banned, this generation has proxy servers, they bypass these blockages. Just recently, to speak volumes to the power of social media, they were killing stray dogs in the city of Shiraz. About 1,000 animal rights activists went in front of the Ministry of Environment and picketed, and this got actually picked up on social media to the point where it went viral, and they actually the regime stopped the killing of stray dogs. So really, again, when you open up those doors that they want closed, I think it has the potential to have a domino effect and hopefully take Iran into a more progressive mainstream, hopefully.
Hi, Harry Geller. I'm the husband of a Barnard 57 graduate.
The year 57.
So I'm concerned about the disparities you're describing. What does that do to sort of a dumbing down of the whole culture, where you have a preponderance of, let's say, disproportionate women graduating higher education versus men? What are the ramifications with regard to this, shall we say, dumbing down, or I'm saying that, and also marital and family issues and the things that could develop, where you get this disconnect between men and women?
Let me take a stab at that one. in the first place, when you shift your higher education to the native language, and you do not make it something that is primarily accessible to people who are in a social class to have gone to a French medium school or a German medium school or an English medium school, it may be that the quality of education is not as high as it was for that elite, but it's now distributed over pretty much the entire population in their own language. So one of the results is that the intellectual vitality of the general public in Iran is extraordinary, much more dynamic, pretty much than any place in the Arab world. Turkey might compare it with it to some degree. But it's partly because it's all going on in Persian. And now you might say that if a student cleric in Qom wants to discuss Heidegger with you, as they do, that they all read these modern theorists, it might not be as sophisticated a discussion as you would get with a faculty member here at Barnard, but it's spread over such a broad population now. There was a book written a long time ago by Sheila Fitzpatrick, one of the first scholars to get access to Soviet archives, and it was on the first generation of people who studied in the universities in Russia after the Bolshevik Revolution, where they gave preference to the children of workers and peasants. And she found that the quality of the education went down because Moscow and St. Petersburg had been important intellectual centers. But the breadth of the educational access was transformative. And it contributed to the very rapid strides that the Soviet Union was able to make economically and in certain other ways during the Bolshevik era. And I think that if you were going to take the most sophisticated intellectual in Iran of 1955 and compare with the most sophisticated intellectual now, I'm not sure what the comparison would be exactly, but you might be able to argue that there has been a lowering of the best. But on the other hand, so many people now are getting this education. And I would say, you do have free state education, but you also have some private colleges that are fee-paying. But one of the interesting tidbits after the Iran-Iraq War, which was devastating for Iran, they had the equivalent of a GI Bill to give educational preference to whom? We had it for people who'd been in uniform as veterans. In Iran, it went to the family members of the martyrs. And so the US GI Bill was almost exclusively for men. But in Iran, the sisters, the daughters, the wives of martyrs in the war could get university preference for admission. And so Tehran University and other state universities started to have a very large number, a quota of these people who came from really from lower class families, because the rich people in Iran bought their way out of the draft during the war in many cases. And the war was largely fought by common people. And now you had a privilege going not just to the veterans, but to the female members of their family. What the effect is on quality, it's hard to say, but it certainly has changed the distribution of education.
Alice Perkins, absolutely no connection to Barnard whatsoever. My question is just very simple. What percentage of women in Iran at the moment would you say are either activists or support activists, as women in the whole country?
It's a great question. Percentage-wise, a high number of women, by definition, are not activists, but a high number of women have other employment, and they do the activism on the side. Recently you had a woman who's an artist, and she's also a women's rights activist. She actually just got 12 and a half years because on the side, She did a satirical cartoon mocking the supreme leader's considering banning vasectomies and access to contraception. So she, by trait, is a painter, but she got 12 and a half years for her activism. So you have many young women who have other jobs and who are in universities and even in high school who on the side do a lot of women's rights activism because it's really, honestly, has become part and parcel of the new generation and part of something that gives them hope for the future.
But would you say that's 50%?
It's a high number. I would say it's probably easily 60%. I mean, there's not, when I say I communicate with women in Iran, I have 17-year-olds who are in high school and who, will run a petition on Facebook. So, that's a minor part of her day, but it still encompasses her day.
Hi, my name is Arietta. I have no affiliation to Barnard College, but I just submitted my undergraduate thesis on Iranian women writers Sharnoosh Parsipour and Samin Danishvar and how their works combat the New Orientalist narrative that I find Azar Nafisi's book, Reading Olit in Tehran, reinforces. But I just wanted to get your opinion on the impact of Islamic feminist discourses in Iran. I know that some women consider themselves Muslim feminists as opposed to Islamic feminists. They don't like to use the terms interchangeably, and that the discourses could potentially isolate secular women who still advocate for women's rights but do not fall under a religious framework. But how are they bridging the gap between religious feminists and secular feminists, and have the discourses been influential in reinterpreting religious texts that are typically read under a patriarchal framework and reinforce oppressive boundaries? Sorry, it's a lot.
That's a great question. The secular feminists in Iran and Islamic feminists generally shun the feminist term, and they like to refer to themselves as women's rights activists. They're educated, traditional women who are want to maintain their religiosity, but also have embarked on something that's very courageous, which is reinterpreting passages in the Quran that's been used to justify for centuries the denigration of women. So the blurred line in post-revolutionary Iran between educated traditional women and educated secular women they have reached an impasse where both sides have one thing in common, and that is to cut the cords of patriarchy. So that is really something that brings them together. They have learned to respect one another's differences because in the end, their end result and their goal is the same thing, which is finding, for the Muslim woman, it's finding liberation from within the text, and for the secular woman, it's finding liberation from within the laws.
Hi, I'm Kayvan Afshari. I just got back from Iran about a week ago, and one of the things I was really thinking about while I was there was to what extent are Islam and Islamic norms imposed from the government, and to what extent is the religion and its norms just a reflection of a deeply religious society. And one way I thought maybe to measure that, maybe I'm misguided here, was whether a woman chooses to wear a chador or not. And as you guys already kind of touched on this topic, because technically it's not required, right? I mean, a woman could just wear a rousserie and show much of her hair. So one would expect that if it was imposed by the government, that she would choose the bare legal minimum and just wear the rousserie. And if it was a reflection of her own desire to wear a chador, she would go ahead and wear the full chador. So the question really is, to what extent is it imposed, and to what extent is it a reflection of her own devoutness?
That's a difficult question to navigate. I think every woman, I have an issue with imposing the veil or not imposing the veil. I don't think any piece of garment for a woman should be mandated. I think every woman should be left to decide for herself whether she wants to cover herself or not cover herself. In terms of what you ask, and I think Professor Bulliet would agree, it's a very difficult question. I'm sure there are women in Iran and there are women outside of Iran who choose to wear the head covering or the veil. So I think the ones that you see that choose to cover up completely, even though, like you said, it's not mandated to the degree where you have to be completely covered, I think they choose to wear the veil, and those that you see that loosely drape it are the ones that are less beholden to such impositions.
I think that the methodologically, the idea that you can assess the depth of piety by something as simple as clothing is probably not a very sound technique. In other words, would anyone look at Americans and be able to identify evangelical Protestants by the clothing that the women wear? No. I mean, it happens to be something you can see in Iran, but I wouldn't read as much into it as you're suggesting.
Hi, my name is Fred Parvin. I'm just a big admirer of Dr. Ansary.
I just wanted to say this gentleman is Iranian, and he is one of the biggest gender advocates, and I have to applaud him because he has been championing the women of Iran since I started. He is a diehard advocate for gender equality. I actually featured him in an article we did at Huffington Post for men for gender equality. So
Thank you very much. I didn't go to Barnard.
What?
I said I didn't go to Barnard. Just a quick question. In the general populace of Iran, what percentage of the men are actually supporting the feminist movement? I know you said that it's incumbent on them to get involved, but I really have a hard time understanding. I know there was a movement that they were taking pictures of themselves.
Yeah,
but realistically, are men really involved? Because when I lived in Iran, even back then, it was sort of frowned upon. So,
you know, I don't think there's I don't think there's a viable statistic that I can give you that I know that's out there. And Professor Bulliet's agreeing with me. So, but in terms of my own interaction, what I see is that you have a young generation. For example, women are not getting married anymore. They're engaging in what's referred to as white marriage in Iran, which is cohabitating without getting married. Now, that's illegal by Islamic law standards, but you have men who are actually not subscribing to the Islamic laws and engaging in what's referred to as white marriage. So that is an indication that these men are not beholden to Islamic patriarchal laws. The other was recently, I'm sure you have a segment that is patriarchal and ideological mindset, but you know, just recently, Nilufar Ardalan, who is the who was the coach for the Iranian girls football team, was banned from her husband from going to Malaysia to lead her teammates. Now, in Iran, a husband can ban his wife from leaving the country. Ironically, this gentleman is a sports journalist, her husband. So I don't. But then you had all these. Then you had all these men, again on social media, Iranian men in Iran, husbands who came out, because in Iran, even though you are married and you fall under that, under the banner of that law, a husband can waive his right to all these amendments. Now, thousands of Iranian husbands came out on social media holding placards saying that they waive their right to hold their wives back in any capacity. So this was huge. This really went viral on social media, and which is what you brought up, and this was only last month. Men in Iran for gender equality that came out in droves in support of Nilufar Ardalan to be able to leave the country without her husband's consent. So in terms of statistics, though, there's no statistics, unfortunately.
Hi, I'm Ann Barnard, 67.
Speak into the mic, please.
Oh, Barnard, 67, where I became a revolutionary and I've remained one, and have followed the events in Iran ever since. I would like to know if the young women are discussing, were inspired by, invoking their mothers and grandmothers and great-great-grandmothers, because there's been a huge women's dimension in every Iranian revolution, from the 1905-06 one, where there were the first women's councils, and certainly in 78, 79, where the women were not only active in getting rid of the Shah, but they were the first ones to realize the danger from Islamic fundamentalism immediately afterwards, when the revolution was virtually hijacked by the clergy, and the women marched on March 8th of 1980 in the streets and shouted, "In the dawn of freedom, there's no freedom." And this was a tremendous moment for the women's movement all over the world to understand that just getting rid of the old regime that's oppressing you is not enough. There has to be the building of a new human egalitarian society. And I just would like to know if the women are discussing their history and the philosophies of those days, including Marxism, not Soviet communism, but genuine Marxism, and whether that plays any role today.
I'm actually looking at Professor Bulliet, and he's looking at me because it's a question that is almost very difficult. Would you agree or disagree with me to answer in terms of what the general female population in Iran, what percentage of them are referring back to the 1905, to the progressive women who initially were bold enough to start and implement the seeds of education and champion the cause of education for women at a time when it was not really valued by the clerical hierarchy. I'm not sure how to really honestly answer this question. It's a difficult question to be able to, unless you're part and parcel of that environment. I don't really know unless.
I would just say that Nina's doctoral dissertation was written under my sponsorship, but Professor Hossein Kamali played an even more important role than I did intellectually in it, and he could probably answer that question.
Well, let me use that as a segue that we will break in a moment, and you can all go find Professor Kamali and ask him this question. But before you mob him, I would once again just like to thank everyone, not only for being here, but for engaging in a fascinating conversation. We could go on, I'm sure, for hours, but we will end. I promised Tina that we would end. I would like to thank both of our speakers today for their incredibly interesting comments. I know that you will all join me in wishing Nina the best of luck with this book and hoping that it has the impact that it deserves. And I can't resist just closing by saying, right before we began, Professor Bulliet mentioned to me that his new book is on the history of the wheel, which is an incredibly good topic. And I actually think it ties into our last questioner, that as we think about transnational feminism, feminism around the world, feminism over time, we have to be careful not to keep reinventing the wheel, but to learn from each other and share. Thank you all so much.